Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Democratic strategist Melissa DeRosa. Melissa, thanks again for coming back on.
Thanks so much for having me, Brittany.
It is the final day of the convention, but last night, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who's also the vice presidential nominee, had the opportunity to talk, to introduce himself to the nation. How do you think he did?
I think he crushed it. I mean, the importance of this convention can't be overstated. You had Tim Walz and you've got Kamala Harris, two people who really hadn't introduced themselves to the nation in a meaningful way yet. Even though Kamala has been vice president for the last 4 years, arguably she's still largely unknown. Tim Walz was totally unknown. And last night he stepped onto that stage and he met the moment. And I think the country, to the extent that the Republicans have been trying to make him this socialist, far left, crazy fringe candidate, I think after last night it doesn't pass the smell test. And I think that he did what he needed to do, which was use that airtime on stage to introduce himself and to define himself before the American people. And the moment with his son, that moment that's sort of gone viral today, couldn't have been more humanizing and more connecting. And so, I mean, I give him an A+ across the board.
Yeah, it was really his chance to, like you said, introduce himself to the country, tell us what he's about. And he talked more about his time as a coach, as a teacher, than he did even in politics. And like you said, that moment of his son crying brought a lot of people to tears. But it seems like there's the DNC is kind of old guard versus new guard. You see the Clintons, you see the Obamas. To some extent, the Bidens seem to be old guard now. And then it's versus new. AOC, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Wes Moore, amongst others. What do you think about this shift, and where do you think that this means the party's going?
I think it's incredible. And you and I were talking about this for a minute before we started taping. And when you think about where we were a month ago in the Democratic Party, it was Joe Biden, 82-year-old man who was the Senate Foreign Relations chair in the 90s. And last night you had Josh Shapiro, you had Wes Moore, you had all of these new faces, Pete Buttigieg, the party of tomorrow. And it feels like, of course, we're going to honor the Clintons. Of course, we're going to honor the Obamas. Of course, we're going to honor Joe Biden. And they were always going to have a voice and a place in this convention. But I think what you've seen as the week has gone on is this tonal shift to what is the Democratic Party of tomorrow? Who are we? And you see this energy, and you see youth, and you see articulation, and you see people who are representing, I think, the face of America for what's to come. And I think it really connects with people who are in their 20s and 30s, but also people who are in their 40s and 50s. And, it's interesting. I think a lot about Nikki Haley when she was running against Donald Trump. She had this line where she said, whichever major party dumps their 80-year-old first is going to win. And it feels like she was prescient. We did, Democrats did, and now look at where we're standing, both in the polls and the energy and the unification of the party. And you couldn't have called this a month ago, but it really does feel like the pieces are all falling into place.
And people are comparing the excitement, the enthusiasm inside the convention to that of 2008 with Barack Obama. But what is the party of tomorrow? Because the DNC, I'm sure you saw the snafu of over 20 references to Biden's second term. Obviously, that was probably a typo because it is Vice President Kamala Harris now at the top of the ticket. But what do you say to those criticisms that this is just a continuation of a Biden presidency? This is a Biden presidency in disguise.
And that's going to be, so we're on a sugar high right now. And I think it's well deserved, and we're meeting the moment and everyone's excited, and that's great. After the convention is over, once we get past Labor Day and things sort of settle down, I think the American public is going to be looking for, what are your policy positions? Who are you? How are you going to lead this nation in a different way than Biden did? And, if she's relitigating Bidenomics, then she's losing. She's going to have a forceful position on dealing with things like inflation that are not price controls, which we saw immediately panned by the Washington Post and sort of more broadly. She's going to have an answer for migrants and immigration and the border crisis. I think that's when things are going to come a lot more into focus on a policy level. And she is going to have to differentiate herself from Joe Biden and stake out positions in the middle. At the end of the day, we are talking to a couple of 100,000 voters in 8 states. That's how you're going to win this election. And so that's what she's going to have to do. She's going to have to draw that contrast. up until this point, she's sort of gotten away without answering any tough questions, answering any questions at all. She's avoided media interviews. And, this is something the Republicans have been pounding on. So September 10th, all of a sudden, is going to become a critically important day, both for Kamala Harris in keeping her momentum going, and for Donald Trump if he hopes to derail the momentum that she's got going. And so I think that's when we're going to have to see her sort of defining herself not just as Biden 2.0, but what does the Harris Walz country look like?
Talk about that a little more. I mean, what does she specifically need to do, and how does she differentiate herself from President Biden? Because it does seem like the Democrats, like you said, are on this sugar high. Vibes are high. Momentum is there. They had star power last night with actors, Stevie Wonder, Oprah Winfrey. The star power is there, but the policy, it seems to be a little light because there was no, at the beginning of the convention, no policy at all on Kamala Harris's campaign page. And when it comes to policy, when it comes to those top issues like immigration, like inflation, like the economy, most voters think Trump's better equipped at handling those.
Yeah, and look, he has been the best thing going for her because he has been screwing up so badly since she has been tapped to be the nominee. It's like he's never been able to find his footing, and he's obsessing about things like crowd size rather than holding her feet to the fire on issues and talking about how he is going to make the country better. And so this is going to be on the part of the Trump campaign. They're going to need to figure out how to discipline him, how to focus him, how to focus their ads, how to focus their issues, and force her to answer some tough questions. And she is going to have to answer some tough questions going into the fall, because at some point the sugar high is going to come down. Everyone's going to come back down to reality. And I'm feeling really good as a Democrat right now, particularly when I consider how I was feeling a month ago when I was talking to you. But when you look at a poll in Wisconsin and you see Harris +1, that to me as a strategist is we could lose by 2. And so, yes, we're in a much better place. Yes, we've got the momentum. But now you've got to figure out how to continue that on into November, which is going to mean speaking to the things that matter to Americans, that Americans talk about at the dinner table. Why is it harder for me to make my mortgage than it was when Donald Trump was president in 2019, putting COVID aside? Why is gas so much more expensive? Why is a burger so much more expensive? Why do I feel like I'm working twice as hard and not making nearly as much? And those are things she's going to have to answer. And she's going to have to do it in a way where she's not disrespectful for President Biden, where she's not disingenuous about her role in that administration, but where she clearly is charting her own path and breaking away and saying, this is what I am going to do differently.
The tenor of this conversation is definitely different than the one we had the day after the debate. And I was talking to another Democratic strategist yesterday, and she said that the strategy that Democrats have seemed to adopt over the past month of when they go low, we go lower, really seems to be working. Because famously, Michelle Obama at the DNC 8 years ago said, when they go low, we go high. The tenor of her speech, the tenor of President Obama's speech, even Bill Clinton's speech, is different than that. They were directly calling out Donald Trump. Do you think, A, this strategy is working, and B, how do you make that last?
Look, I think that for a long time, Democrats have tried to take the high road in a way that, while admirable, is a losing strategy. You can't show up to a knife fight with a squirt gun. And that's what Democrats were doing in 2016 in that famous Michelle Obama speech. And everyone's subscribing to, we're not going to stoop as low as he is. Now, we shouldn't lie the way he does. We shouldn't distort reality. We shouldn't go out there and, replicate his behavior. But I think that we have to answer his criticisms with our own. We have to be on offense. And I think this is the first time that the party really feels like we're doing that. And you feel energy in the rank and file. They like throwing a punch. They want to know you're going to fight for them and you're going to fight him and define him. Elections are about defining yourself and defining the opposition. There's this phrase I'll never forget learning in the first campaign I did where they said, kill him in the cradle, where it's, at the very start of a campaign, throw all your resources at something to define who your opponent is so they can never get up off the ground. And you see Democrats adopting much more of that strategy this time around, which was successful for Trump in 2016. And I think it feels good. Again, I'm not advocating that we should adopt his tactics that I think are, dishonest with the American public. But I think, you got to get in there and fight. If you're not going to get in there and fight, you're not going to win. And maybe you can tell yourself, oh, I did the more respectable thing, but you know what? There's no prize for a second place here.
What is the winning strategy against Donald Trump, do you think? Because he's no longer in the cradle. He's been a national figure for decades now, but B, a political one for a decade right now. So how do you define him now when he's been able to maneuver away from being a convicted felon, all these labels thrown at him because his supporters don't seem to care?
It's interesting. And again, it's, his supporters put him aside. If they're with Donald Trump, then forget it. They're never going to be with Kamala Harris. Again, it's those couple 100,000 voters in 8 states that matter at the end of the day. Those Sunbelt swing states and those Great Lakes swing states. And that's who you're talking to. And I think on those issues, it's got to be pocketbooks. Donald Trump cares about his rich, wealthy friends. He wants tax giveaways for himself and people like him who are not like you. When it comes to women's rights, when it comes to being able to, make decisions for your own women's reproductive health, you've got to say this is a ticket who not only wants women to be able to make their own choices, as we've been able to do since 1972 when Roe v. Wade was enshrined in the Constitution, but they now want to take away things like IVF, which so many people in America, regardless of your political leanings, have dealt with infertility and other issues, struggling to be able to create a family. They have J.D. Vance, who, reviles women who make the choice not to create a family. And so they've got to tap into these issues that we see resonating. And I think that having a woman at the top of the ticket allows them a unique vantage point to make some of those arguments, which, by the way, have been a gift handed to them by the Trump campaign because they keep screwing up and making all of these mistakes. It's funny when they went out against IVF and Kellyanne Conway immediately put out a polling memo party-wide saying IVF is supported by 90% of the country. What are we doing? They drank too much of their own Kool-Aid on sort of the Make America Great Again and going backwards. And while there are some zealots who take those positions, those are very, very few and far between. And so that's what Kamala and that's what Tim Walz have to do. Identify those issues in those 8 states that speak to those in the middle and keep chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. And you can't be in the margin of error. You've got to be up by 5, up by 7, so that on election day, you can win by 3.
I do want to talk about the issue of the war in Gaza. Last night, one of the most touching moments was when Hersh Goldberg Poland's parents, he's a hostage, an Israeli-American hostage who is in Gaza, that when they were speaking, the crowd started chanting, "Bring them home." There's also a protest of uncommitted delegates. They were not given a speaking slot at the DNC. How does the Democratic Party walk this line and grapple with this issue?
I think that we did it pretty well last night. And I think you even saw in AOC's speech on Monday where she talked about the need for there to be a ceasefire, but she said it had to come along with releasing of the hostages. I think it took a while for Democrats to find our footing on this issue, but it is critically important to the Jewish population in this country, by the way, as well as non-Jews like me who care very deeply about this and so many others, where you can't negotiate with terrorists. There can be no ceasefire without releasing of the hostages. And I think we finally figured out at the top how to walk that line. And, the fear going into the convention, which I think you and I spoke about a couple of months ago, especially coming out of, the Columbia University and all of the unrest we saw on the college campuses at the end of May, was that this convention was going to be completely disrupted by those protests. And it hasn't been. It's been very, very muted. And to the extent that they were trying to, put it in the press, the mainstream media really didn't buy into it. And so I think that we go into the fall, once again, in a good place on this issue. There's still a lot that remains to be seen. I think about what could happen in the fall, what could shift this race. And there's so many things that are out of our direct control, including what's going on in the Middle East, including the geopolitics of Ukraine and Russia, including inflation, including the migrant, what could happen that, some big high profile crime committed by an illegal migrant that then highlights the border crisis, any of these things. But it's going to be interesting to see when the kids go back to school, if we see some more of that unrest and push that more to the forefront and how Democrats deal with it. But I've got to say, in the convention so far, we've done a very good job.
It feels like every time you and I have talked, which is once every couple of weeks, there is a big unprecedented event, historic event that fundamentally shakes this election. And I am curious what you think history will remember about this moment, because let's start from 2 months ago. President Biden had that disastrous debate performance, which then led to a sort of attempt to push him out. He eventually did drop out of the race. Kamala Harris, there was no open convention. She became the likely nominee in 2 days. Right now, she's at the top of the ticket without a primary vote cast for her. So when the excitement really fizzles out, what do you think the legacy of this moment will be? How will history remember the Democratic Party right now?
You know, it'll be interesting because on election day, if she wins, I think it'll remember it very differently than if she loses. But I think either way, at the end of the day, it's going to be that the Democratic Party in a moment decided to put the country over individual power. And whether Joe Biden was pushed out, people are trying to give him credit for stepping out on his own, but really I think he did it with a gun to his head. I think that it was one of the few times where I feel like Democrats were able to be really disciplined and strategic and say, this isn't about you, Joe Biden. This is about beating Donald Trump. And we need to all come together with one voice and walk in a straight line to beat him. They always say Republicans, vote with their head, Democrats vote with their heart. And in 2016, when I think about Hillary Clinton losing to Donald Trump, I personally blame a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who stayed home and protest and then gave us Donald Trump. And I think that we learned from that moment and we weren't going to let it happen again. And so it's been quite the ride. In that recap of what you just said, we even left out that Donald Trump, there was an attempted assassination. I mean, you couldn't have predicted any of this. And who knows? You and I could be talking in 3 weeks and it could be diametrically opposed again. And we could be looking at, oh my God, Trump is going to win. What's the Access Hollywood tape of the fall going to be? Who knows? What's the James Comey event of the fall going to be? Who knows? And so we'll see what happens. But I think it's going to be that the Democrats finally figured out how to get their act together and said, we are not going to lose. We are not going to be losers anymore. We are not going to willfully go off the cliff. And we rallied and we came together.
What do you think then President Biden's legacy is going to be? Because there was what seemed to be this coordinated effort to push him out. He says he was not pushed out. It was his decision himself. But he is no longer in the race. He received really a hero's welcome Monday at the DNC, signs that said, thank you, Joe, chants of thank you, Joe, and about a 5-minute standing ovation. How is history remembering him in the books?
It's funny because during this convention, Monday night, that moment aside, it almost feels like he's been an asterisk since the moment he handed the baton to Kamala Harris. No one talks about him. No one pays attention to him. It's almost like Joe who. I think that ultimately, in looking back, history will be kind to him. He took the presidency away from Donald Trump in the height of COVID. He steadied the ship. He brought the United States' standing back on the globe in a way that we were no longer a joke. It was no longer we were being governed on Twitter. And, he stopped, I think, the erosion of rights from being taken away. I think that that's where history will ultimately remember him. I think in the short term, history will remember the debate performance and the fact that it appeared he had dementia and had to be forced out of that seat. But I think the longer term view of Joe Biden is going to be very kind.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much. I love our conversations. I'm sure we will get probably another August surprise, September surprise, October surprise running up to the election. So I hope you come back on and talk about them with me. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.